Sometimes, life presents us with people who arrive without warning, without promises, without defined plans. They enter like passers-by, but stay like those who build a home. I was only 17 years old when I agreed to help my father with a simple job in another municipal region. Nothing extraordinary, just another period of life that seemed temporary. I didn't know, but some stories begin exactly like that, without apparent importance. Because destiny doesn't announce its moves. It just acts. It was there, far from home, far from what I knew, that I met a 14-year-old girl. There were no speeches, no eternal promises, just sincere glances, shy conversations, and a feeling that grew too fast for someone who was still learning to understand the world. Too young to plan, too immature to decide, but intense enough to feel something that doesn't fade with time. And even without knowing, at that moment, something was engraved forever. Not in memory, but in the heart. Some loves don't make a sound when they arrive. They settle in silence, and that's why they take so long to leave. We were only together for a few weeks, simple weeks, but filled with an intensity that only those who have experienced first love understand. When the time came to leave, there were no grand farewells. There was no maturity to close cycles. Just the strange feeling of leaving something unfinished behind. I left taking two small things with me, almost insignificant to anyone else, a 3x4 photo, and a folded piece of paper, with a phrase that time could never erase. Don't forget, I love you. That phrase wasn't a goodbye. It was an anchor. And even without realizing it, at that moment, I wasn't just leaving a city. I was carrying with me a love that would cross years, distances, silences, and choices, patiently waiting for the right moment to return. Tell me, from where in the world are you watching this story? I was 17 years old, and at that stage of life everything seems temporary. The days, the jobs, the people. Nothing seemed definitive, because when you're young, you believe there will always be time later. That's when my father invited me to help him with some repairs outside our municipal area. It wasn't a big project. It wasn't a dream. It was just work, the kind that appears and disappears without leaving any apparent trace. I accepted without thinking much, like someone accepting a short detour, without imagining that certain detours don't take us off course. They reveal the true path. I arrived at that place believing I would stay a short time, that I would do what needed to be done, and that I would soon return home exactly as I had gone. But life, silent and precise, was already preparing something that cannot be explained. It just happens, because some stories don't begin with big decisions. They begin with simple steps, taken unintentionally, but full of purpose. It was in this ordinary scenario, without anything extraordinary, that I met her. A 14-year-old girl, simple, shy, with a smile that didn't draw attention for its brightness, but for the peace it transmitted. There was no immediate impact. There wasn't that instant certainty that movies promise. There was presence. Short conversations, unpretentious encounters, restrained laughter, and a feeling that grew without asking permission. We didn't talk about the future, because we were still learning what the present was. There were no promises. There were no plans. There was only the now, and the now seemed enough. And perhaps that's why it was so strong. Because we didn't try to control. We just felt. Sometimes the deepest feelings are born like that, when we're not prepared, when we're not looking, when we're not defended. I didn't know. But that simple encounter, in the middle of an ordinary job, was becoming the first chapter of a story that time would try to erase but would never succeed. What began as simple encounters soon transformed into something difficult to explain. Because when we are very young, we don't know how to name our feelings. We just feel them. There was no official relationship. There were no rules, no demands. We were two hearts still learning to exist in the world. Even so, Each conversation seemed longer than it actually was. Each goodbye carried a strange weight, as if time was always running against us. I realized that this feeling was growing silently, without fanfare, without promises, but with a force that didn't depend on words. It was as if something had been activated inside me, something I didn't yet know how to protect or understand. And perhaps that's why it was so intense, because there were no defenses, no past experiences, only raw truth, felt for the first time. Youth has this power. It transforms ordinary days into eternal memories. A glance was enough, a shy smile, a meaningless conversation, and everything gained meaning. We didn't talk about tomorrow because tomorrow seemed too far away for someone who was still discovering today. It was a love that demanded nothing, didn't expect a future. It simply existed. And it's precisely this kind of feeling that leaves the biggest mark, because it's born free, without expectations, without fear of losing. I didn't know it at that moment, but that bond was forming like a deep root, invisible to the eyes, but strong enough to withstand time. Some feelings don't need much time to become permanent. They just need truth. And even though it lasted only a few weeks, that young love was engraved in me in a way that the following years, the distances, and the new people could never erase. It was only a few weeks, but when you're young, time isn't measured in calendars. It's measured in intensity. Each day seemed longer than the last. Each encounter carried a silent urgency, as if, even without knowing it, we felt that it wouldn't last long. There was no routine, no plans, just the desire to be close, to hear each other's voices, to share silences. Sometimes we didn't say anything important, and yet, everything seemed essential. It was a feeling too big for two people so young, a kind of passion that doesn't ask permission to be born. It simply happens, and takes up space. I realized that something in me was changing, that simple affection no longer fit the label of friendship, but I also didn't yet know if it was love. Maybe it was everything at once, confusing, intense, true. When you experience your first deep feeling, you don't know how to take care of it. You don't understand limits. You don't understand time. You don't understand goodbyes. You just feel, and you feel strongly. I wasn't mature enough to understand the weight of it, but my heart understood, even if my mind couldn't keep up. Every laugh of hers stayed with me for hours. Every simple gesture gained disproportionate importance. It was as if the world became quieter when we were together, and noisier when we were apart. And perhaps that's why it hurt so much afterward, because feelings like that, when they aren't prepared to leave deep scars. Youth doesn't teach you how to lose. It only teaches you how to live. The problem with intensity is that it doesn't warn you when it's going to hurt. We lived in that moment without imagining the impact it would have on the future, without knowing that some experiences don't just pass and they remain. I believed that it would stay there, kept in that time, in that city. But I was wrong. What I felt there became a reference, a measure, a constant memory. Later, when I met other people, I didn't compare on purpose, but the heart recognizes what was once true. That short passion, lived without promises, became a small flame, but constant, that never went out. Because some feelings don't need much time to mark an entire life, they only need surrender. The farewell didn't arrive as a scheduled event. It approached slowly, almost unnoticed. One day I simply knew I needed to leave, that the work was over, that chapter was coming to an end before it even became whole. There was no long conversation, no mature decision, because we were still too young to understand what it meant to end something that was still alive. The departure happened without ceremony, without promises of return, without the security of a "see you later." Just the strange feeling of leaving behind something that still pulsed within me. I left trying to act naturally as if it were just another change, but my heart didn't follow that reasoning. It stayed, trapped in that place, in that story that didn't have time to organize itself. When someone leaves without closing a cycle, something remains open inside us. I felt it in the silence of the nights, in the emptiness that arose without warning. It wasn't ordinary longing. It was the feeling of interruption, like a book closed in the middle of a page. There were no fights, no harsh words, and perhaps that's why it hurt more. Sometimes what hurts isn't what was said, it's what was never said. I carried with me questions that had no answers, feelings that found no conclusion. Her absence began to occupy unexpected spaces, and I didn't know it yet. But that emptiness was becoming part of me. Some separations don't teach you to forget. They teach you to live with the absence. It was in that silent farewell that the strongest memories were born. The 3-4 photo? Small, simple, almost without material value. And that folded piece of paper with few words, but enough weight to last for years. Don't forget, I love you. That phrase didn't seem like a request. It seemed like an affirmation. I left believing that time would solve everything, that distance would erase what we felt. But time doesn't erase what was true. It only hides it, until the right moment to reveal it again. That day, when I left, I didn't lose a love. I planted something that would still take many years to bloom. Because there are goodbyes that don't end stories. They only pause what still needs to continue. Time began to pass, and with it came new paths, new routines, new people. Life went on as it always does, without asking if the heart kept up. I met other girls, lived other stories, smiled in other places, but there was something that remained intact, silent, resilient. Even when I believed I was moving on, her memory would appear at the most unexpected moments. Not as pain, but as presence. It was strange to realize that someone from so little time occupied such a large space. I tried to understand, but some things don't need explanation, only acceptance. Because when a feeling is true, it doesn't compete with the present. It simply exists, like a living memory, waiting. The 3i4 photo remained stored, not as an attachment, but as a witness, small, faded by time, but intact in its meaning. That piece of paper with the simple phrase, "Don't forget, I love you," was no longer just a memory. It was a symbol, a silent reminder that something real had happened. Sometimes I would find it by chance, stored among old things, and for a few seconds, everything would come back. The smell of the place, the sound of conversations, the shy way of smiling. It was as if time folded upon itself and took me back. Some memories don't age, they just wait for the right moment to be felt again. Over the years, I began to understand that certain loves don't ask for space in the present. They ask for respect in the heart. She never stopped me from living, never held me back in the past, but she also never let me forget. It was like a small flame, constant, that didn't need to grow, just not go out. Perhaps that's what made everything so strong. The fact that there were no demands, no expectations, just the silent certainty that something true existed and remained there, firm, even without contact, even without news, even without promises. Because some feelings don't need to be lived every day to remain alive. They survive time, distance, and choices, patiently waiting for the moment when life decides to cross paths again. The years went by, and with them came the illusion that time is capable of erasing everything. 4 years have passed since that silent farewell, and, on the outside, life seemed to follow its natural course. I matured, took on new responsibilities. I met other people, lived other stories. There were laughs, encounters, sincere attempts to move on. But inside, Something remained untouched. It wasn't an open pain, it was a constant memory, discreet, almost polite, that never asked for attention, but never disappeared. Sometimes it would surface in a quick thought, other times in a dream, or in a song that played without warning. It was proof that some feelings don't need to be fed to survive. They just endure. I tried to convince myself that it was just nostalgia, a youthful thing, something that would be left behind with time. But the heart doesn't obey logic. Even when I was with someone, there were moments of involuntary comparison, not for lack of affection, but because certain connections create an internal pattern. It wasn't fair, nor conscious. It simply happened. She never left my mind. Not as an invasive presence way, but as a fixed point, a place where thought could always return. And perhaps the most curious thing was this. There was no constant suffering. There was recognition. The recognition that something true left a mark, and marks don't disappear. They just become part of who we are. Over time, I learned that not all love is meant to be lived immediately. Some arrive too soon, when we don't yet know how to care, when we don't yet know how to stay. They appear, transform us, and leave. Not for lack of feeling, but for lack of the right time. That short story, lived in youth, began to take on a different meaning with the years. It was no longer just a memory. It was a lesson, a silent reminder that true love doesn't depend on constant presence. It depends on truth. And while I continued living, working, growing, that discreet flame remained lit, without haste, as if it knew that life, one day, would find the exact moment to rekindle everything again. Time, always time, continued doing what it does best, carrying life forward. It was then that I started working for a long-distance bus company. A different routine. Long roads, scheduled times, cities passing by the window like quick chapters of a book we almost never have time to read. I kept working, focused, without imagining that those same roads, that seemed like just through paths, were, in fact, preparing a reunion. Sometimes life doesn't shorten distances. It just positions people in the right place, waiting for the exact moment. And it was on one of those ordinary trips, on one of those days that promised nothing, that the past decided to knock on the door, in a simple way, almost discreetly. The bus stopped in a city I knew well. Her city. A passenger got on, an ordinary guy. Quick conversation. Nothing out of the ordinary. But something made me ask, almost without thinking, almost impulsively, about her. It wasn't empty curiosity. It was that question I'd kept for years, waiting for courage. When I heard he was her cousin, I felt a strange silence inside me, as if time had slowed down. I asked about her, and the answer came with a naturalness that disarmed me. He said she was living in the capital, in Fortaleza, the same city where I was also working. Sometimes destiny doesn't shout, it whispers, and those who are attentive listen. At that moment, something awakened again. It wasn't euphoria. It was silent expectation. Knowing that we were in the same city, after so many years, seemed too much of a coincidence to ignore. The cousin said he would talk to her, that he would tell her I was working at that company. I continued my journey, but I wasn't the same anymore. The past, which was once just a memory, now had an address, had a possibility. I didn't know if she remembered me, if she still held on to something, or if it would just remain another unfinished story. But there was something different, a feeling that life was moving forward, aligning old pieces. Because some stories don't begin again with grand declarations. They begin again with a simple piece of information, said at the exact moment, in the exact place, to the right people. After that unexpected encounter on the bus, nothing seemed exactly the same. I followed my routine, kept to my schedule, did what needed to be done. But inside, there was a new movement. Silent, almost imperceptible. The information that she was in Fortaleza wasn't just a detail. It was a possibility. And possibilities, when they involve old feelings, have a different weight. I didn't know if she would actually get in touch, if she would remember me with the same affection, or if that chapter was definitively closed for her. Still, something inside me remained attentive, like someone waiting without anxiety, but with contained hope. Because when destiny begins to move, it doesn't ask for haste, it asks for presence. The days passed, and each trip to the bus station carried a silent expectation. There were no plans, no active search, just the feeling that something could happen at any moment. I observed the faces, the hurried steps, the encounters and farewells that happen every day in that place. The bus station has always been a place of departures, but during that period, it also began to represent the idea of reunion. It was as if time was suspended there, between arrivals and departures, waiting for the right moment to cross paths that had already touched in the past. Sometimes the heart recognizes the scene, even before recognizing the moment. I didn't know that she had already been notified about me, that my name had been said, that my presence had already been remembered. This part of the story was still happening far from me, in silence, like so many other important things in life. And perhaps that's how it needs to be. Some reunions aren't built with messages, nor with direct warnings. They are built with time, coincidence, and courage. I just kept going, working, waiting without knowing exactly what. But something was clear. After so many years, after so many attempts to move on, that discreet flame was beginning to stir again. And when a true feeling awakens, even after a long time, it doesn't arrive with a bang. It arrives calmly, like someone who always knew that one day they would find their way back. That day, nothing seemed different. I was working normally at the bus company, fulfilling another shift, another wait at the bus station. For me, it was just part of the routine, a place where people arrive and depart all the time, almost never leaving a mark. I didn't know that at the same time. She had decided to go there, without any certainty, without any guarantee of finding me. She had no confirmation, no warning, just a silent impulse, one of those that you can't explain. Just obey. Sometimes the heart feels before reason, and guides steps that seem random but never are. While I waited for the moment to leave, she crossed that same space, guided only by memory, and by something that still had no name. That's when it happened. Amidst the movement, the noise, the crossed voices, I glanced sideways, almost reflexively, and saw a face that needed no introduction. A smile, a familiar light, something that time couldn't alter. My heart recognized it even before my mind confirmed it, and the words came out simply, almost timidly, as if time had turned back many years. Is it you? There was no exaggerated surprise, nor immediate euphoria. There was recognition. Two glances that met again, after so many years, in the most unlikely place, on the most ordinary day. That coincidence was too great to be just chance, but too simple to seem planned. It was as if life had aligned everything. I did patiently, waiting for the exact second. There, in that instant, it became clear that some stories are not lost. They just wait for the right moment to continue. She went to the bus station without certainty. I was there without expectation, and yet, we met. This says a lot about how destiny works. It doesn't force. It brings people closer. It wasn't a cinematic reunion. It was real, human, silently powerful. And perhaps that's why it was so memorable. Because when something true returns, it doesn't need a spectacle, just presence. That day, between buses, schedules, and hurried steps, the past met the present and showed that what is true may even move away, but never loses its way back. After that unlikely reunion, everything seemed to have fallen back into place. We started seeing each other again, now with more awareness, more words, more understanding of what we felt. We were no longer teenagers. Time had passed. Life had taught us some lessons. The relationship happened naturally, without haste, like someone resuming something that never completely ceased to exist. There was affection. There was conversation. There was a sense of continuity. We spent almost a year together, building moments, creating new memories based on the old ones. It seemed that we would finally have the chance to live what had been interrupted before. But life, once again, showed that feeling is not the only thing that sustains a story. As time passed, routine began to weigh on us. There were no fights, no dramatic breakups. There was silence. That kind of silence that settles in when enthusiasm wanes, when conversations become shorter, when the future ceases to be a topic of conversation. The flame didn't go out, but it grew weaker, and it hurts in a different way, because there's no clear culprit, no specific reason to point the finger at, just the feeling that something changed, and nobody knew exactly when. Sometimes love doesn't end. It just gets tired of waiting for maturity, direction, decision. And at that moment, maybe we weren't ready to sustain what we felt. The decision to go our separate ways came without many words, almost like a silent agreement. I went to São Paulo, taking with me another goodbye, another interrupted attempt. I met other people, lived other experiences, but the pattern repeated itself. She was still there, in the back of my mind, in the back of my heart, like a story that insisted on not ending. That separation didn't erase what existed. It only postponed it again. And perhaps that was the hardest lesson. Understanding that some stories don't fail for lack of love. They fail because the right time hasn't arrived yet. The feeling was there, intact, but it still needed to mature before it could become definitive. São Paulo welcomed me as it welcomes almost everyone, with haste, noise, and the silent promise of a new beginning. It was too big a city to contain old feelings. At least that's what I believed. I threw myself into work, into routine, into new possibilities, like someone trying to fill every space to avoid hearing their own silence. I met other girls, lived other stories, some light, others intense, but none definitive. On the outside, it seemed I had moved on. On the inside, something remained suspended. It wasn't suffering. It was a lack of closure, as if a part of me was still waiting for something I couldn't name. Sometimes we move to a new city, but we take our hearts exactly as they were, even surrounded by people. There were moments when everything was quiet inside. It was in those moments that she reappeared in my memory, effortlessly, uninvited. A face, a memory, an old feeling that appeared out of nowhere. I didn't nurture it on purpose. I didn't seek news. I didn't create expectations. Yet, she never left my mind. It was like a low, constant background music playing while life goes on. And perhaps that's what differentiates certain feelings. They don't interrupt your life, they just accompany it. I kept living, but something within me remained connected to a time that hadn't yet finished unfolding. It was during this period that I began to understand something important. Not all love enters our lives to stay immediately. Some arrive too early, when we are still under construction, when we don't know how to sustain what we feel. They come, transform us, and leave, not as punishment, but as preparation. In São Paulo, amidst so many attempts, I realized that no other feeling occupied the same place. not through conscious comparison, but through internal recognition. She wasn't just part of the past. She was part of my emotional formation, without knowing, even without contact and even without plans. Something was being preserved, waiting for the right time. Because when a feeling is true, it doesn't demand constant presence. It just waits. Time went on, as it always does, without warning of what it's preparing. 4 more years passed. Years of distance, of absolute silence, of lives unfolding separately. There was no contact, no news. There wasn't even the certainty that the memory of the other side still existed, and yet, something remained, not as anxiety, nor as daily pain, but as a silent presence that never completely faded. I no longer expected anything. At least that's what I told myself. Life had taught me not to create expectations, to accept the intervals, to move on even without answers. But the heart, once again, continued at a different rhythm. During this period, I continued living. I worked. I matured. I learned from mistakes. I built new versions of myself. I met good people, honest stories, but none could occupy that specific space. Not for lack of effort, but because certain places are irreplaceable. Sometimes, love doesn't repeat itself. It just continues, in a different way, in silence. I realized that that old story didn't stop me from moving forward, but it also didn't allow me to forget. It was like a half-open door that never closed completely, even when I tried. And maybe that was necessary, because some things need to remain open until time brings the answer. It was in this prolonged silence that the feeling transformed. It was no longer passion, no longer youthful longing. It was something deeper, calmer, more conscious. A kind of love that doesn't demand presence or constant confirmation. A love that accepts time, that respects the paths, that doesn't demand explanations. I didn't know. But while I went on with my life, something was being prepared on the other side, in the same silence, in the same waiting. Because when two stories are truly connected, they don't need to touch all the time. They just follow, parallel, until the right moment makes them cross again. The letter arrived without warning, like things that change everything. It wasn't a special date. There were no expectations. It was just another ordinary day, until it wasn't. When I saw my name, something inside me slowed down. That envelope carried more than paper. It carried time, silence, history. I opened it slowly, almost too carefully, like someone who knows that some words have weight. And they did. She wrote that if I hadn't forgotten, if I still remembered, that I should call her. There were no demands, no requirements, just the courage to expose herself after so many years. At that moment, I knew. That was one of the happiest days of my life, because some messages don't arrive to reopen wounds. They arrive to close cycles, or restart them in the right way. Holding that letter was like holding the past and the future at the same time. All the memories returned, not as confusion, but as confirmation. The feeling that had never gone away now had a voice. I called, and when I heard her voice, something clicked simply, naturally, definitively. There was no need for long explanations or justifications, because time had already done that work for us. We talked like people who had never stopped knowing each other, like people who had simply resumed a conversation interrupted years ago. Sometimes love doesn't need a restart, it just needs continuity. From that day on, we started dating over the phone. Long conversations, extended nights, words that now had maturity. We were no longer the confused young people we once were. There was understanding, patience, purpose. The feeling remained the same, but now it came with awareness. Each call built something solid, something we couldn't sustain before. In silence, love had matured. And when a true feeling finds maturity, it ceases to be doubt and becomes a decision. That letter wasn't a coincidence. It was the sign that time, finally, was ready. Long-distance dating wasn't a challenge. It was a confirmation. For 7 months, the phone became a bridge and a shelter and a presence. There was no physical touch and no physical routine. But there was truth. The conversations were long, deep, without any rush to end. We talked about everything. About the past, about what we learned apart, about who we had become. Each word was laden with maturity, care, choice. There was no longer any doubt, nor fear of wasting time. The love that had previously been interrupted now walked firmly, consciously, without the anxiety of youth. Sometimes distance doesn't separate. It purifies. It reveals if the feeling is real, or just dependent on presence. It was during this period that we realized something simple and definitive. We didn't need to prove anything to each other. The feeling didn't need urgency. It needed a decision. We had already lived enough apart to know the value of being together. The past ceased to be a burden and became a foundation. We no longer talked about if it would work out. We talked about when. Time, which before always seemed wrong, was now finally working in our favor. Love had learned to wait, and whoever learns to wait also learns to stay. After 7 months came the decision. We got married, without fanfare, without excess, but with certainty. It wasn't a leap in the dark, it was a firm step, a step taken by two people who had already been separated by time and united by maturity. Marriage wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the right continuation, at the right time. There were no empty promises. There was real commitment. The love that had crossed years, distances, silences, now found a place to stay. Because when something is true, it doesn't need to rush. It arrives exactly when it's ready to last. Time passed. And this time, it stayed. The years accumulated not as a burden, but as a construction. Today, it's almost 30 years of marriage, a whole life shared in simple and profound details. It wasn't a perfect journey, because none are, but it was true. We learned to grow together, to respect the silences, to value the permanence. Love ceased to be an expectation and became a daily choice. That story that began in youth, interrupted so many times, now was sustained in maturity, in care, in the decision to remain even when enchantment gives way to routine. Because that's where love proves its strength, when it chooses to stay. From this union came our son, now 22 years old, already engaged, following his own path. Seeing this is understanding that some stories don't end with two people. They multiply. Looking at him is seeing that everything was worth it. The silences, the distances, the waiting. Each phase had a purpose, even when it seemed like only pain or uncertainty. The love that has endured through time has become a foundation, an example. Continuity. Sometimes the greatest proof that something was real is realizing what it has built over the years. Today, when I look back, I understand. Not everything that takes time is wrong. Not everything that is lost is over. Some stories need time, maturity, disagreements to become complete. That passport photo, that simple phrase, have spanned decades because the feeling was true. Love didn't abandon us. It just waited for us. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. What is real is not lost in time. It prepares itself in silence, until it finds the right moment to remain forever. Looking back at this whole story, it's clear that not everything in life happens when we want it to, but almost everything happens when we're ready. There were encounters, separations, long silences, paths that seemed definitive, but weren't. Love didn't follow us hastily. It watched us mature. Each separation had a purpose. Each wait shaped who we needed to become. Today, we understand that if it had been different, perhaps it wouldn't have lasted, because strong feelings without maturity are lost. But true feelings, when they find the right time, remain. Nothing was in vain. Not the pain, not the distance, not the years of silence. This story isn't just about love. It's about time, about learning that some answers don't come quickly, and that insisting before the time can destroy what should last. Youth felt it, but maturity sustained it. Love didn't chase after it, didn't demand it, didn't pressure it. It waited, and waiting, sometimes, is the greatest act of faith someone can have. Faith that what is true finds its way, even when everything seems to indicate the opposite. Destiny cannot be explained, but it reveals itself, step by step, to those who do not give up on feeling. If there is something to learn here, it is that some stories don't end. They just take long pauses. Pauses necessary for two people to become whole, before becoming one. Perhaps you are experiencing silence now. Perhaps there is someone who has never left your mind. Perhaps you think that time has taken away what was important. But time does not take away what is true. It keeps it. It keeps it until you are ready to recognize it, to care for it, to remain. Because the love that is worthwhile is not lost in haste. It is built in waiting. And when it arrives to stay. If this story resonated with you, don't ignore that feeling. Maybe because, at some point in your life, you too loved someone without knowing if it was the right time. Maybe because there's a memory that never left your mind, even after years. If this touched your heart, leave a comment below. Write just one word in the comments. I waited. Sometimes sharing is the simplest way to acknowledge what still lives within us. And now tell me, where in the world are you watching this story from? If you believe that true love doesn't rush, doesn't force, it just waits. Like this video. This helps this story reach other people who also need to hear that not everything that takes time is lost. And if you know someone who has experienced an interrupted love, someone who needs to understand that time can also be an ally, share this video with that person. Sometimes a true story arrives exactly when someone is about to give up. And if you want to keep hearing real stories, profound stories, that speak of love, time, faith, and permanence, subscribe to the channel. Here, each story is a silent reminder that what is true is not lost. It just finds the right moment to stay.